welcome everyone to the Unwinnable War, the US in Afghanistan, given by Ms. Rozina Ali and organized by the Duke UNC Consortium for Middle East Studies and by the Center for Middle Eastern and North African Studies at the University of Michigan. Ms. Rozina Ali is a fellow at Type Media Center. Her reporting and essays on the Middle East, the war on terror, and Islamophobia in the United States have appeared in The New Yorker, The Nation, The Guardian, The New York Times, Al Jazeera America, Foreign Policy, the Los Angeles Review of Books, and many others. She was on the editorial staff of The New Yorker from 2015 to 2019 and was previously a senior editor at the Cairo Review of Global Affairs based in Cairo, Egypt. Ms. Ali, thank you so much for joining us today. We're so delighted to have you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. So it's really nice to be here today. I'm so glad that I get a chance to talk to all of you about something that we have obviously been watching very closely for the last 7 months. For some people, what happened in Afghanistan last August and September was a complete shock. For a lot of people who are watching, it was not a shock, but it was still tragic. And I think it's really useful to remember what it is that the US was doing in Afghanistan. So last summer, the United States announced it was ending what became its longest war in its history when it pulled out its troops from the country. The US had an active presence in the country for 20 years. And in that time, more than 240,000 Afghans were killed. About 5.9 million Afghans were displaced. And by the end of it, the Taliban regime came back into power, the very group that we had sought to destroy when the US entered Afghanistan in 2001. So what does victory look like for the US in Afghanistan? What I'm going to do in this talk is provide some context about what happened, why the US can't quite claim victory in Afghanistan, and why, in a lot of respects, this war is not yet over. Just to let you know, I am going to be speaking. I'll present first, and then I would love to hear your questions. I'll open it up for a Q&A, and I would really love to hear from all of you guys, what you guys are thinking, what questions you may have, and I would love this to be a discussion. So please feel free to include your questions in the chat or ask them after the presentation. And I'll let you know when that ends. So to really understand what happened in Afghanistan over the past 20 years, it's really useful to provide some history on where Afghanistan was when the US invaded in 2001. So just to give you a bit of background of what a lot of Afghans were going through. In the 70s, the country was going through an internal power struggle between different political camps. And in 1978, the Soviet Union helped launch a coup against the sitting president and put a Moscow-backed Communist Party in power. But there was a lot of turmoil and opposition to this new regime, especially coming from religious communities and the countryside. One, because this new regime was imposing a lot of cultural and social norms that Afghans were unfamiliar with. And two, this regime was also undertaking a lot of drastic economic land reforms, which did not serve a lot of people in the countryside. So there was a lot of turmoil and opposition building to this communist regime. So the year after the coup, in 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan to support the communist regime and basically occupied the country for the next 9 years. But Afghanistan became a conflict that served as a proxy war for the larger world powers. So it wasn't just the Soviet Union who got involved, but also the United States and Britain, who threw their support behind rebel fighters called the Mujahideen, which many of you might have heard that term before. But the US and the UK threw their support behind the Mujahideen because the Mujahideen were fighting the Soviet Union and the Soviet-backed regime. And remember, this is in the context of the Cold War, and this is in the context of the US and Soviet Union basically vying for power and fighting each other in a lot of third-party countries. What the US was doing was they sent a lot of aid in the form of money and weapons through Pakistan into Afghanistan to help bolster the Mujahideen and their efforts against the Soviet Union. Interestingly, the US also tried to help romanticize and encourage violence against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. So, for example, the CIA and a lot of US academics in America helped produce textbooks for Afghan students that were used in the 80s. And these textbooks, including math textbooks, encouraged violence against Soviet soldiers. So there would be math problems, for example, that included examples of an Afghan shooting a Soviet soldier. And what was happening was that the US was actively propagating messaging that it was Afghans' Islamic duty to kill Soviet soldiers. They were actively using the term jihad and trying to justify Afghan opposition to the Soviet Union. And the relationship between the US and the Mujahideen was quite close in this time. The Mujahideen even had lectures and set up some offices in the US. There were some Mujahideen leaders who met with President Reagan in the Oval Office. And another key feature of this war is that there were thousands of foreign fighters coming to join the rebel cause in Afghanistan, which actually a lot of these things we see parallels to today. We see, for example, in Ukraine, we're seeing a lot of foreign soldiers going to Ukraine to help fight. So I bring that up to help you understand what that context was at that time in the 80s. Of course, we know now that among the foreign fighters who joined the rebel cause in Afghanistan was a man named Osama bin Laden, who went on to form and fund Al-Qaeda and fund the resistance. But basically, the conflict between direct Soviet power, Soviet occupation in Afghanistan, that lasted about 9-10 years. It left 1 million Afghans dead. The Soviet Union withdrew in 1989, but at that point, Afghanistan descended into a brutal civil war. And the reason for that was because, or one of the main reasons, the political reason for that is because while the Mujahideen, the rebels, they were united against Soviet occupation, they were not united in their political vision of how to govern Afghanistan. So what Afghans were subject to was a terrible, brutal civil war in which there was pillaging, killings, random looting. Um, there was very little security. There was very little law and order. And it was around this time, in the mid 1990s, that one of the factions of the Mujahideen, the Taliban, an Islamic militia, they rose in prominence, they gained popularity, and they came to power because they were able to promise Afghans something that they had not seen in a very long time, which is relative peace, relative security, and law and order. Afghans didn't necessarily agree with the Taliban regime. They didn't agree with all of the political vision of the Taliban. But for the first time in a long time, here was a group that could save them from the civil war. So what was the US's relationship with the Taliban at this time? The US surprisingly did not recognize the Taliban regime when it came to power in the mid-90s. It put the Taliban on the sanctions list in 1998 or 1999. But interestingly, the US never put Taliban on its foreign terrorist organization list, meaning it never formally called it a terrorist organization, which turned out to be useful later on because it allowed the United States to conduct peace talks with them later, which helped pave the way to what happened last year. So that brings us to 2001. What happened in 2001? Well, we all know that after the 9/11 attacks, the US invaded Afghanistan almost immediately. They invaded the country the following month in October. Not because the Taliban had been responsible for the attacks, but because Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden had a haven in Afghanistan. And it's really critical to remember that by the time that the US invaded in 2001, most Afghans had not seen peace and stability for more than 20 years. Many Afghans had just seen war. The space, that window of stability that the Taliban offered was very short-lived. And it was also in pockets of the country. The Taliban did rule the country, but it did not have control over the entire country because historically Afghanistan has pretty much been a decentralized state. So Afghans didn't, when the US invaded and another war started, Afghans didn't really have an appetite for it. So that was on the Afghan side. What was happening on the US side, which is very critical and helps explain the failure of America over the next 20 years, is that the US didn't declare a war on Afghanistan. It declared a war on terror. And this framing did two things. One, it obscured the reality of the recent civil war that had shaped Afghan lives, that had shaped the political and social, cultural security milieu of the country. And remember that because of the civil war, Afghanistan had become one of the poorest places in the world. The other thing that this war on terror framing did was it confused who the actual threat was. So when we use the word terrorist, that word tends to obscure more than illuminate. Because when we use that word, we conflate groups. So the US did do that. The US conflated groups like the Taliban and Al-Qaeda and Hezbollah and later ISIS. And when it did so, it ignored the local factors that helped bolster support for these groups and bring them to power. So for example, by calling Taliban terrorists, as bad as Al-Qaeda, it really obscured why the Taliban had even gained support in the first place in the 90s. Now, even at the time, after the US invasion, there were a lot of critics who pointed this out. They actually were saying, wait a minute, that term terrorism doesn't actually shed light on our opponents. And there was a historian who even gave an interview to a journalist and at the time and said, terrorism is a tactic. So when we say we're launching a war on terror, it's a bit like saying that the Second World War was a war against Blitzkrieg, which was basically the Nazi military tactic of militarily wiping out entire cities. That's a tactic, and it's ridiculous to wage a war against a tactic. But that's essentially what we were doing in 2001. So what happened on the ground after the US invaded? Well, surprisingly, the Taliban actually largely surrendered. Remember, Afghans didn't want another war. The group had basically fallen by November. They offered a conditional surrender, meaning that they would lay down their arms and in return for amnesty, that they would hand over Osama bin Laden to a third country. The Taliban was willing to walk away. The Bush administration, and specifically Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, rejected that surrender, which in retrospect is tragic because the war could have been over in a matter of months. Instead, it dragged on for 20 years. And accepting that surrender could have changed the course of Afghanistan and maybe in some respects, even our country. But it's also important to remember that at the time, this surrender was not shaping public conversation. What was shaping conversation at the time was the need to fight terrorism, which, as I pointed out, is an amorphous and ill-defined enemy. But that was our mandate. And along with that, our mandate was to bring freedom to parts of the world, including Afghanistan. So you can already start to see why this nebulous vision or this end goal isn't achievable, because it's too abstract. We're not even saying that the war will be over once we eradicate or once we take a regime out of power, which we did in October 2001. Our goal was definitely more nebulous and abstract. We still can't define what it means to end terrorism and bring freedom to parts of the world. But the US in 2001 decided that they were going to continue this war. So what happens when the enemy, the Taliban, has largely surrendered, but there is an entire military apparatus and money and political and public consensus to fight a war against this enemy? Well, what essentially happens is you end up creating enemies that help justify perpetuating this war. So part of the problem of terrorist being so ill-defined is that anyone could be a terrorist. And that's what happened in Afghanistan. On the ground, what was happening was that people were using the United States to settle old rivalries. And what they were doing was accusing people of being part of Taliban or Al-Qaeda, even if they weren't. But what that did was that the US would then pick up people, or the US-backed Afghan government would pick up people and send them to prison, or in a lot of cases, even kill them. And remember, there were a lot of these political rivalries after 20 years of civil war, a lot of political, personal rivalries, a lot of desire to get even with neighbors or communities who may have wronged you. And a lot of people had incentive to use the United States to get even with certain enemies. The other thing that happened is that the war, in effect, the money that we were pouring into the war effort helped bloat the coffers of a lot of warlords and put them in power. And what that did was make life really, really difficult for a lot of civilians. For example, I mean, these warlords were basically running gangs. And so what happened to a lot of people were that, if you were like, you couldn't cross a checkpoint without being shaken down for money or be threatened for your life. And if that's what's happening to you, if you can't even travel to the next town without fear that you might be killed or you might be kidnapped, you'd start to think that there was no justice in this US-backed regime. There was no justice in this US occupation. Now, another thing that was happening was that there was a lot of bad intelligence on the ground, and the US acted on a lot of bad intelligence. So there were airstrikes and ground raids, nighttime raids that killed innocent families. And what that meant, and yes, Kabul, we saw that actually Kabul was one of those cities that did do better. There was a lot of economic and political development, but outside of Kabul, and a lot of places, especially that used to be Taliban territory and Taliban strongholds, there were a lot more counterterrorism measures like airstrikes, like raids. And it meant that a lot of people started turning away from the US. They started turning away from the US-backed government. And we saw the very same thing in Afghanistan in the 80s. This is what people were doing against the Soviet occupation as well. What was happening during the US occupation was that people were turning towards a familiar opposition, which was the Taliban. And so ultimately, the Taliban movement, which had largely been defeated in 2001, I mean, the leaders had basically slipped into the mountains or slipped into Pakistan, they came back. The Taliban movement grew in popularity because it offered one of the very few alternatives to the US and the Afghan government, which was essentially killing people, killing innocent civilians. A journalist I know likes to say that the US won the war in Afghanistan in 2001 and lost it by 2005. And I think that holds very true. By 2005, the Taliban had essentially gained enough support in a lot of the rural areas and a lot of the pockets that they already had a stronghold, and they were gaining momentum. All that said, even though this was a failing strategy militarily, these tactics still continued until recently. American airstrikes continued to hit civilian targets. There was a US airstrike that hit a hospital run by Doctors Without Borders in Afghanistan in 2015. And this is, Doctors Without Borders gives coordinates of its location to all of the militaries. So the US knew where it was based. The US still hit airstrikes on this hospital, claiming that there were Taliban members inside. And when there was a congressional session about this, the then Senator Jeff Sessions actually justified the airstrike by saying, well, the US is waging the good war. We're fighting the bad guys, so it's okay if we do this airstrike. So imagine if this is what Afghans are hearing, that their lives don't matter because the US is there to fight terrorists. But for Afghans, that is a constructed dichotomy. for Afghans, that dichotomy between the West and terrorism doesn't mean anything because they were fighting against the occupiers who were ruining the lives of their families. In 2018, I spoke with someone in Afghanistan who had lost his father and 4 uncles because a CIA-backed counterterrorism force had raided their house one night. This was in 2018, raided their house one night on faulty intelligence and executed all the older men of the family. This was a young man, he was 19, and he lost his father and uncles all in one night. Unfortunately, for 20 years, the US government maintained a fiction to itself, to the American public, that we were fighting a just and good war. But to a lot of Afghans on the ground, that is not the case at all. Now, the flip side to this, beyond military, actually, military is related to this. What was happening was that there was very little movement towards state building or finding peace in Afghanistan. The US did allocate an obscenely large amount, I think the biggest outside of the Marshall Plan, $133 billion for reconstruction in Afghanistan. But the Afghan government was mired in corruption. This money that was funneled in incentivized warlords, and as I mentioned earlier, just bloated their power. The funds were very ill spent. So, for example, there was one study that found that in a span of 10 years from 2002 to 2013, donors had spent about $50 billion on conferences on Afghanistan, how to organize Afghanistan's finances, or seminars on conflict prevention. And just to give you a sense of how ridiculously spent this money was, there was one American lieutenant general who remembered that he was based in a district in Afghanistan, and he mentioned how the US Army Corps of Engineers had built a police headquarters in a district. And this was a beautiful police headquarters. It was new, it had a glass facade, there was an atrium, it was very modern and sleek. Now, this lieutenant general showed up for the ribbon cutting ceremony where the local police chief was cutting the ribbon. But the Afghan police chief couldn't even open the door because he had never seen glass doors like this. He just did not know how to open these doors. And that really, and what the lieutenant general says, and I think is so poignant, is that that experience encapsulates the whole experience of how the US reconstructed in Afghanistan. It was really, really badly spent. And what the US did was poured in a lot of money too fast, forgot that this was a very poor country, tried to impose social, cultural, and political and economic norms in a very severely short period of time. This is not to say that the US did nothing right. There were some gains. There was an uptick in there was a decrease in infant mortality, there was a decrease in malnutrition, health indicators improved largely. A lot of girls got educated, which was excellent, but often that happened in city centers or in faraway provinces. But one Afghan journalist said recently, the problem is that these improvements came at an enormous human cost. So it made some people nurses and doctors, but it made other women widows and orphans. And it's true, while some women were being educated, other women had to save themselves from airstrikes and drone attacks or raids by these counterterrorism units. So ultimately, the US government didn't really prioritize nation building. And what struck me about this, and we really see this, is that I was following closely. I was in touch with a lot of Afghans and a lot of groups last summer when the pullout happened. And what struck me was that the pullout, that so many Afghans were able to be evacuated was because that effort was being driven by civilians in the US and in Europe. It was being driven by journalists, by lawyers, by activists, by NGO groups. They were doing the job of the US government, which really highlights where the US's priorities have been regarding Afghanistan over the past 20 years. They placed resources on counterterrorism, but less so on preparing for humanitarian needs for Afghans. For 20 years, since 2001, the US-backed Afghan government has basically depended on the US's foreign aid to keep it running, and it has depended on the US military to keep it secure. And both those things stopped last year. So now we get to what happened when that pullout happened last September. So early last year, Joe Biden declared that the US would pull out of Afghanistan and end the US's on-the-ground presence in the country by September. This was only possible because this move had bipartisan support. The previous year, Donald Trump, when he was president, had made the same announcement. He said that the US would do this, and that actually got the ball rolling. But what I would like to really emphasize in today's conversation is that the US's pullout of Afghanistan doesn't actually mean that the war is over. And the reason for this is twofold. The first is that the US has not declared an end to its war on terror. So remember, as I mentioned earlier, that in 2001, the US didn't declare a war in Afghanistan, they declared a war against terrorists. So what that means is, in this year, in 2022, militarily and legally, the US still maintains the power to continue using drone strikes or airstrikes in Afghanistan to target terrorists. And they are already doing that. They're already doing that against ISIS, which unfortunately now has a growing presence in the country. And in fact, almost immediately after the pullout last September, President Biden said in an announcement that drone strikes indeed will continue in Afghanistan. What's going to be interesting is whether the US and the Taliban regime will coordinate on targeting ISIS through these airstrikes, and it's something that we'll just see in the coming months. But the second reason that the war is not over, and I think this is the most important reason, is that modern warfare does not happen just militarily, but also economically. And the immediate way we see this war continuing is the effects of sanctions. So when the US pulled out and the Taliban regime took control again, took power again in September, the US immediately did two things. One, it revived the sanctions against the Taliban regime that had initially imposed back in 1999. And these are very blanket, broad sanctions, which means they affect all Afghans. The second thing that the US did was that it froze Afghanistan's central bank assets that are being held in the US. And that's about $7 billion worth of Afghan money, which means Afghans did not and do not have access to their own country's money because it is being frozen by the US. And to give you a sense of where economic warfare and the war on terror kind of converge, earlier this year, Joe Biden made a decision to give half of that $7 billion, so 3.5 billion, to families of 9/11 victims. Even though, as I mentioned, the Taliban was not directly involved in the 9/11 attacks. So this economic warfare has essentially had devastating consequences on Afghans. So remember that I had mentioned that there was very little state building that happened over the last 20 years. What that meant is that last year, even before the pullout, foreign aid accounted for 75% of public spending in Afghanistan, which means now the Taliban government has no money to pay the public sector. It has no money to pay doctors and teachers. It also means that people don't have cash to buy food because the US has frozen the central bank's assets. There's no cash coming into the banks. So people can't retrieve cash, which means they can't actually buy basic materials like fuel, food, water. This has been devastating. And I just to give you a sense of how devastating, 23 million Afghans right now, are under the threat of starvation. And what that means is that more people will likely die from the economic impact of sanctions in the coming year, in 1 year, than those who died in 20 years of military conflict. We're already seeing reports that families are resorting to sell their children or their body parts to feed their families. Most of the population, about 80%, is in debt. And already in the first 3 months of this year alone, in 3 months, 13,000 newborn babies have died because of lack of nutrition, lack of food. And I'm saying to you all this, what I want to emphasize here is that, the US may have pulled out of Afghanistan militarily, but we are still determining the lives of millions of Afghans. And this is not just tragic, but it is a tragedy that is our own doing. We never had a vision for what victory would look like in Afghanistan because we rejected a possible victory there. And because of that, we were not going to win. This is an unwinnable war. And what the US can do now, the immediate thing they could do now is lift sanctions in order to save more than 23 million Afghans who will likely die because of starvation. The last thing I want to mention before I open it up to questions is I just want to remind us all that there are a lot of Afghans, if not most, who have seen nothing in their lifetimes except war for 40 years. And, I actually imagine it's the same for a lot of your students, all of your students, given their age. They have known nothing except the war on terror. Even if they can't remember, even if they don't know why 9/11 happened, why we went to Afghanistan and Iraq afterward, they have grown up in that framing of war. The difference is that this war has literally impacted Afghans' lives. It has literally killed them. Their lives are at stake. So I hope we can think about, after 20 years of conflict in which the US has left devastation in its wake, it has killed and displaced millions of Afghans. It now continues to kill and displace even more through economic sanctions. the driving questions for me, at least, and I hope you think about them too, is when will this war end? And what do we owe Afghans now? So I'll stop here, and I am very much looking forward to talking to you and hearing your questions.
Thank you so much, Ms. Ali. An incredibly thought-provoking, heart-tugging, and in many ways outrageous presentation. So thank you very much. I would like to open up the floor for questions or remarks for Ms. Ali. You can drop them in the chat. If you'd like to unmute yourself, we welcome that as well. So yes, the floor is open. Thank you, everyone. I wonder if I can pose a question while people are thinking. Oh, great. No, Heather has a question. I can hold off. I'm so happy. Okay. Would you like me to read the question for you, Ms. Ali?
Oh, I got it. Yeah, that's a great question. So the question is, what now? Many US citizens feel helpless to do anything, and what can be done? That's a very, very good question. It's a very important question. So I think there are two immediate things that can be done that US citizens can definitely do. One is to put pressure on our government officials, to put pressure on the Biden administration to lift the sanctions. I'm sure a lot of you guys have heard of the concern being that the Taliban regime has banned girls' education. And that is true. And that is terrible. It is awful. But girls can't go to school if they are starving. And this is a very, very basic thing that we can do, is help lift sanctions so that Afghan civilians can get access to basic needs. The second thing that we can do is not forget the plight of Afghan refugees, especially those that are coming to the US. Now, a lot of them have come to the US. A lot of them have entered, but they are on temporary visas. And in the next 7-8 months, these visas are set to expire. And what is going to happen is that a lot of these refugees are going to be facing the US immigration bureaucracy. And I think what we can do is keep these issues front and center. We can be talking to our government officials about what is the US doing in Afghanistan. We can talk to them about what are we, maybe talk to local immigrant rights groups to see how they're dealing with Afghan refugees, see how we as communities can support them. But there's a lot that there's space for, and especially in the coming months, we're going to see that a lot of Afghan refugees in the US will need more American attention on their plight. The danger is that the US media and people will forget about them, and I hope we don't. I hope we still keep an eye. Thank you for that question.
Other questions? Very much invite comment, remark, questions for Ms. Ali. I think if you'll allow me a question, Ms. Ali, I'm just going off of what you said, is to keep the issues front and center. How do ordinary Americans, ordinary residents in the United States, how do we get the real news? Like, there's so much misinformation. You mentioned mainstream media and the failure of mainstream news media. Where should people go for their reputable news sources so that they can put pressure and keep these issues front and center?
Yeah, that's also a very good question. yes, there was a lot of failures in the media, in especially in 2001 and after the invasion. I will say, I have a lot of critiques of the journalism industry as a journalist myself, but um, a lot of journalists have learned um, from the mistakes. They have learned about, you know, what went wrong over the last 20 years, and I see a lot of great and respected journalists doing the hard work of not of really investigating and digging for the truth. That said, that's a much larger general response. On the question of Afghan refugees, I think the most critical thing is actually paying attention to local news. I think a lot of local newspapers are doing really great work covering some of these issues, covering what a lot of communities are facing. And especially in places like we're seeing a lot of Afghans settle down in Dallas, in Virginia, in the Midwest, in California. There are a lot of NGO groups that are popping up, and there are a lot of local newspapers that are doing work, really doing good work trying to cover these issues.
So we have a question for you, but I wonder if I could just piggyback or just continue with that line of thinking. What kind of, since we have a group of teachers here, educators, what do you think would be a really helpful guiding principles or approaches to teaching to be inclusive for children and their families who come from Afghanistan as refugees, as asylum seekers, or in a very transient way? Are there some guiding principles, attitudes that you would recommend to this group of teachers to take up, Ms. Ali?
Yeah, I won't pretend to know what educators should do because you guys do amazing work and I think it's very difficult. So kudos to you. But one thing that has always worried me is how the war on terror framing persists even to today. And I hope that that is a framing that we can start moving away from, because I think there's a tendency for the larger American public to even view the Afghan war as a war between Taliban terrorists versus the good guys, the US. And for a lot of Afghans on the ground, that wasn't the case. So I think it's really, it's almost as simple as just like remembering and reframing, even in our minds, that a lot of Afghan refugees didn't just come out of a war on terror. They came out of essentially a civil war and an occupation. And they perhaps don't think about terrorism like we do. Again, this is a social and political framing that we've imposed on a country that has already been going through years and years of war. So I think I would just suggest meeting Afghans where they are rather than imposing this framework that we have been subject to for so long.
Yeah, a very wise attitude or position to take, Ms. Ali. We have some questions coming in for you. There's one from Sumaya. Are Afghan families seeking asylum or migrating to other non-Western countries, Middle East, Asia, etc.?
Yes, they are. So a lot of them, most of them are in Pakistan and then Iran. And that makes sense. They're the neighboring countries. There's difficulty with this because Pakistan, unfortunately, does not have the economic or physical bandwidth to actually take in and absorb all of these refugees. And in fact, during the civil war of the 80s, a lot of Afghans fled to Pakistan. And there are people who grew up in refugee camps because it's very, very difficult to get out of a refugee camp. So there are people who've basically lived their childhood and adolescence in refugee camps. And that's not, that's not a life I think anyone would want for Afghan families now. But that's unfortunately what's happening in Pakistan. A lot of Afghans are trying to leave. They're obviously, because of the economic devastation of the country, they're just leaving as quickly as they can. But it's becoming very difficult for them. So the borders are being closed, unfortunately, in Iran, in Europe, in other places in the Middle East. They're still trying to get there if they have the money, they can get there legally, but it's unfortunately a very, very difficult situation for them.
Thank you, Ms. Ali. Amy has two questions for you. The first is, in your opinion, what are the top 3 lessons the United States should learn diplomatically, militarily, from its involvement in Afghanistan? And then the second one, which I'm happy to reread to you if you would like, after answering the first, is what do you believe will be the most profound legacy of the war in Afghanistan within Afghanistan?
Very, very excellent questions. There are so many lessons to learn, but some of the ones that really stick to, that really are front and center for me, are that the US can't do state building if it isn't paying attention to the local and political context of a place. And what the US essentially did in Afghanistan was pour in a lot of money that ended up going to a lot of elites and going to the killing of a lot of civilians. I don't think the US is incapable of helping do state building, but I do think that it should have learned it should have recognized that Afghanistan had a very, very unique political, social, and economic context, and they ignored that. The other lesson, and is we didn't really get into this, but one of the groups that became very wealthy in this war were private contractors, American private contractors. And I hope that the US military learns that this is perhaps not the best way to conduct modern warfare, because private contractors don't have an incentive to work for peace. They just have an incentive to make money doing the military dirty work. We never had an eye on peace in Afghanistan, and I think that was one of our biggest detriments. And the last lesson, the big one, and I know I've been harping on this, was that I really hope the US reconsiders what it means to fight the war on terror and recognize that because that framing is so abstract, it's unwinnable. And that's unfortunately what we saw in Afghanistan. The second part of the question, what do I believe will be the most profound legacy of the war in Afghanistan within Afghanistan? Very, very good question. Unfortunately, it is the rise of the Taliban. It is, and it's too early to say where that will go. The Taliban does not have strict and full control of the country, but for a lot of Afghans, understandably, they are wondering, what was this all for?
Thank you, Ms. Ali. Heather has a question for you. In your opinion, what role did the US's lack of linguistic capabilities play regarding intelligence failures of the US in Afghanistan, like a lack of Dari, Pashtun speakers in US military and Department of Defense? And if you'll allow me, what other kinds of lacks besides the linguistic capability did they suffer from?
Yeah, that's a very excellent question. There were actually a lot of intelligence failures due to just linguistic capabilities, but also not understanding that a lot of people had very similar sounding names, not understanding family structures sometimes, or tribal structures. So because of all those failures, there were misspellings, or the US took people who they thought were on their wanted list, and that ended up not being the case. the US relied so much on certain types of Afghan translators, um, uh, but they had either their own vendetta, or they just lacked, even very contextual local knowledge. So we saw a lot of that play out. Fun fact, unfortunately, linguistic failures have actually also led to terrible convictions in US courts regarding terrorist cases. And that happened several times, where the translator in the court didn't speak the local dialect, which caused misinterpretation issues.
Thank you so much, Ms. Abby. Ryan has a question for you. Are there specific books you would recommend to give educators and or students a greater context on Afghanistan?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. So off the top of my head, I would recommend 3. One is No Good Men Among the Living by Anand Gopal, which really looks at the failure of the US's war on terror in Afghanistan. The second is by Craig Whitlock. I'm forgetting the name of it, but it was just released this year. And that looks at the failures from the military and funding side of the US. And the third is a book that was just recently released by another journalist named Matt Eakins, called Naked Don't Fear the Water. And that is a story about an Afghan refugee trying to leave the country in 2015 and trying to make his way through Europe. And I think all of these 3 books will give you a very different sense of some of the big issues and themes in the last 2 decades.
That's great. Thank you. Could you, may I ask, just to follow up, would you please repeat the name of the first one? No Good Men?
Oh, yes. No Good Men Among the Living.
Among the Living, yes. And then the second author was Craig
Whitlock.
Okay, great. Thank
Yes.
you.
I'm sorry, I don't remember the name of it.
But all right, Ryan says thank you. So that's fantastic. The message has been delivered. A question from Maha for you. She says, I am from Lebanon. Yes. Do you want me to read it for you, or shall I do that?
Oh, yeah, please.
Okay. I am from Lebanon, and I feel that a lot of the Middle Eastern leaders are losing respect for the US because of the inconsistency and perceived lack of understanding of local cultures. This, in some cases, throws some Arab countries into the arms of China, Russia, and Iran. I feel that the West needs to be, quote unquote, educated about how to deal with the other. Do you agree? And how do you think we can go about doing this?
Yeah, that's a really excellent question. I do agree with you to an extent. What has been really fascinating and interesting over the last 2 decades is that there has been a flourishing of a lot of experts on the Middle East. And maybe you guys may have noticed this as well, but there are a lot more universities dedicating classes to the Middle East politics, to Arabic and Dari and Pashto languages. There are a lot. I feel like so much of my generation ended up going into Islamic studies to understand a lot of the issues. I think the thing that the US failed to do is sometimes it got so mired in religion that it failed to recognize what was a religious context, how religion plays, how religion is manifested in political and local cultural contexts. I do think that it's not so much that the West needs to be, I mean, perhaps it is that the West needs to be educated about how to deal with the other, but I think that's not an issue just regarding the Middle East. I think this is an issue regarding how we see the rest of the world. And especially when we have used this war on terror framing, we have, kind of obscured this idea that people are people. They are shaped by the political and social and economic contexts in which they grow up. So if you are a young boy in Afghanistan who heard stories about war from his parents, who has seen nothing but war, who has just maybe seen your family either starve or get shaken down from any, you might join the Taliban. Is that because you're a religious fanatic? No, it's because you grew up in a particular context. And I think this is what is missing from a lot of the West when it thinks about wars diplomatically or militarily or other countries. I don't think China and Russia and Iran are any better. I have been to Syria, I have been to Lebanon, I have been to Iraq, I have talked to I've talked to people who have lost family members because of militias backed by Russia and Iran. And what you see is that a lot of these powers are doing the same thing that the US was doing too. I think what is missing from a lot of this is that at the end of the day, democracy can't be imposed. The idea of freedom can't be imposed, but we should really meet people where they are. A lot of people in the Middle East and in Afghanistan want democracy. They want good things for their families, and that is something that we can all understand. These are not ununderstandable people, and I think I really hope the West recognizes that one day.
I think what you're suggesting, Ms. Ali, too, is that people on a very personal level don't have a hard time. They have an easy time understanding the plight or the exigencies of other people. I think the complication happens for many of us is when our governments get involved. Like, how do I, for example, I'm speaking hypothetically, how do I take my ire, my disgust, my concern to my government, and when I can easily identify if I find out about the lives of civilian Afghans and their plights, like the numbers you were saying were heartbreaking about the devastation on the ground for Afghans. So I think that's one of the challenges that some of us might face.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And, I think one of the things that has been missing in the last 20 years of this war is an opposition in the US, in opposition to this war. There were anti-war protests after Iraq, but not so much after the invasion of Afghanistan. And I think we should think about what it means to really stand in. We can both be against the Taliban regime and also stand in solidarity with Afghan civilians. And I do think that, what's sadly missing is right now is a contingent in the US really fighting and pressuring the US government to, for example, stop the sanctions, remove the sanctions. But I think that is something that can be built, especially when we'll see more Afghan refugees coming to the US, especially when hopefully we start to hear more and more about what's happening. I think as long as we stay engaged, as long as we remind our elected officials that we're still paying attention, I think that can go a long way.
I wanted to sort of piggyback, and I had a question as well, Ms. Ali, about especially with Afghan refugees coming to the United States, with educators maybe seeing more of these refugees in their classrooms. What are some ways that they can support these students and their families, and or frame their teaching to be sensitive? I know a lot of these topics come up, war and things like that, but when you're dealing with students who actually encountered this in the firsthand, what are some ways that they can be sensitive as well?
Yeah, I think one thing to just keep in mind is that a lot of people probably went through traumatic experiences, living in a conflict zone, or even trying to escape Afghanistan. It's very harrowing, it's very exhausting. So I think just being mindful of that. No one knows better what they need than they. Like, I think we should be in a position of more asking. Another thing that I just, perhaps want to suggest, and I say this because this was something I witnessed growing up in California in my schools, was kind of a vilification of religion, of Islam. And I'm not saying that my teacher said Islam is terrible, but I think when we ask a Muslim, for example, to explain, well, what does your religion say about this? That's actually putting a lot of pressure on someone. None of us grew up to be religious scholars, even if we are religious. And so I think being mindful of the fact that a lot of children are just children, even, like they have been through so much. And I think just recognizing that they probably have a lot more interesting things to tell you if you let them, and that perhaps that you and I aren't even thinking about, because they're the ones with the experiences and the stories.
Good question. Thank you. I have one more question for you, if you don't mind. I'm just thinking about what you said about the President Biden allocating Afghan money to the families of the surviving members of those who fell during 9/11. I'm wondering if you, in your opinion, what is the effects of such an action on obviously on Afghans, but also on the families and on other Americans? What kinds of messages does that send, in your opinion?
That's a great question. I think it was a very poorly executed and bad decision, because it tied 9/11 to Afghanistan in a way that after 20 years, we know that Afghanistan was not responsible for 9/11. We knew that by 2001. And the fact that we're perpetuating this falsehood is, I think, really disrespectful to both Americans and Afghans. The second thing I want to emphasize is that this money does not go to all of the families of 9/11 victims. It only goes to one small group of them, which is only a group of about, I believe, a dozen families, if I'm not mistaken. Because within this group, there are already a lot of factions themselves. So unfortunately, this money is for, imagine, $3.5 billion for 12 families, and it could go to saving millions and millions of Afghans. I think the calculus is pretty apparent. I think there's no justification.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ms. Alia. I think on that sobering thought, we are going to say thank you so much for your presentation. Thank you, everyone, for attending the Unwinnable War, the US and Afghanistan with Ms. Rozina Ali. Please now complete the brief survey. We would love to know what went well and what we can do better next time, so that you join us at future series that we have, or future outreach that we do. There is the link, and we could have the next slide, please. Contemporary Middle East, thank you, in Context has been funded by 2 Title VI grants awarded by the US Department of Education to the Center for Middle Eastern and North African Studies at the University of Michigan, and to the Duke UNC Consortium for Middle East Studies. The center and the consortium have been designated by the US Department of Education as national resource centers to provide reputable and relevant content about the Middle East. Please do visit our websites and join our outreach listservs, and expect in a follow-up email the certificate of attendance and a link to this recording. A lot of people have asked for it. And please do stay connected. Finally, thank you once more for joining us today for the Unwinnable War with Ms. Rozina Ali. Please take advantage of our future offerings of professional development in reputable and relevant content about the Middle East. And goodbye for now, everyone. Thank you so much for being here, for coming, for joining us today.
Thank you, everyone.